During the Great War, the US would mobilize men much faster than their arms, and so relied on French equipment for much of the war, so much so that Gladiator would produce an American Chauchat. Hi, I'm Othais, and this guy, ooh baby, this guy takes a moment to set up just like the last one, although it's no easier to work with this bipod. I think I've just gotten a little bit used to it since filming the last episode, so I think we're safe. This is the US machine rifle 30 caliber model of 1918, the Chauchat, or as the doughboys would like to call it, the Chauchat. Let's get it over to the light box. Once again, we have a gun that turns in at 20 pounds unloaded and has an overall length of 45 inches. This time, however, it does chamber the 30-06 cartridge with its own unique, less curved magazine. This corrugated nightmare has a capacity of 16 rounds. First and foremost, this is episode 2 of 2, so if you missed the previous, you're probably going to want to check it out because unlike our usual presentation where I kind of cover some previous history, we're not doing it this time. We're going to dive right into what the heck's going on here. I know a lot of you are excited for this exact gun. It's supposed to be the worst automatic firearm of the war. Everybody loves that. That's what the rumors are anyway. But before we can talk about whether that's true and why, there's actually a precursor to this gun by just a few months. Sadly, I don't have an example here today, but I can at least talk about it based on some history. We can see here in the hands of some Belgians, their own rimless 7.65mm cartridge fitted to a standard CSRG 1915. But pourquoi? Well, as you might recall, Belgium was the first country to take it on the nose from Germany, and the country was largely occupied in the beginning stages of the war. We've had a couple episodes that deal with Belgian arms acquisitions during this particular period. They cover things like the Colt 1903 pistols, Mauser carbines made in the US, antique Gras as aid, and somewhat fresher Lebel rifles provided by the French. Belgium was taking aid where they could, and with most major powers struggling to meet their own machine gun demands, only the Chauchat seemed to be available in any significant numbers to guarantee rapid deliveries. These would begin in December of 1916 with the bog standard CSRG 1915 we saw last episode. These were pulled straight from the French assembly lines, still in 8mm Lebel. By the end of the war, they would have 3,250 in active service with an unknown number in reserve. And the trouble here is I'm not sure what percentage of those remained in 8mm Lebel. You see, Belgium never quite surrendered their own cartridge. We saw this Mauser-made 7.65 adopted in both Belgium and the Ottoman Empire. While it was standard at the outbreak, it was largely being displaced by 8mm Lebel thanks to French equipment adoption. Largely. There were still plenty of Belgians using 7.65 Mauser rifles, and the Belgian government wanted to keep those numbers up and reduce instances of mixed ammunition at a squad level. So Belgian engineers were sent to Gladiator, and they cooked up a very simple conversion system from 8mm Lebel to 7.65 Mauser. It used nearly all the original parts and paired the gun with a much less curved magazine. By all accounts, the Belgian Chauchat was much better than the original, giving good service throughout the war and beyond. The guns were so well received that they would see further improvement in 1927. They added a better bipod, eased the disassembly mechanism, and put on that sliding dust cover. These served until they were pushed out by the mid-1930s adoption of the FN-made variant BAR. Alright, so we know about the Belgian conversion, but what I have is a 30-06 right here in front of me. How the heck did that happen? Well, as some of you may be aware, going into this series, war were declared. On April 6th of 1917, the United States of America declared war on Germany and officially entered the Great War over 2.5 years into the conflict. with all that extra time and having been the manufacturing base for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of small arms, the US was in a unique position to observe and understand the equipment needs of a modern army in trench warfare and be able to deliver those same needs for themselves. So of course, the nation was completely prepared for the fight with millions of guns ready to go. Yeah, not so much. US material shortages were almost as bad as those faced by the major powers, who were surprised by the size of the conflict in 1914. Training was also not up to date or nearly detailed enough. Thankfully, General Pershing recognized this issue and insisted on improved, longer instruction for the freshly enlisted. While the bulk of the American Expeditionary Force wasn't going to arrive until 1918, the US did send along a smaller 14,000-man shipment by June of 1917. These soldiers were destined to serve under French, British, and Australian commands, using their equipment and arms and gathering important battlefield experience before the larger force arrived. Pershing happily snapped up 1,700 or so CSRG while training his initial troops. He wanted the machine rifles and some borrowed Hotchkiss 1914s on hand just in case of any surprise pushes through that American sector. Additional orders would follow, and while I'm skipping well ahead here, total US supplies of the 8mm Chauchat would rise to roughly 16,000 by the end of the war. While use of foreign equipment was partially for the ease of integration, it was also thanks to, again, shortages and lack of forethought at home. These were particularly sharp in the category of automatic weapons. Way back in 1904, the US had adopted the Maxim gun in the largest and heaviest variant of the modern version on the globe. It was a beast and produced in numbers small enough to be completely ineffective for this conflict. In 1909, the Ordnance Department had been amazingly forward-thinking by adopting the Hotchkiss Portative or Ben-A Merci light machine gun. However, they proved unpopular, particularly in service against Pancho Villa, and so their limited numbers were not bulked up for the potential Great War service, nor were they used overseas at all. With the failures of the previous two guns, the US started to shop around and settled on the excellent Vickers gun in 1915. Colt was ordered to produce them right away, and absolutely none were delivered by the time the US entered the war. So yeah, this is not going well. Of course, in hindsight, we know that two near-perfect automatics were on the way. The Browning 1917, that's a heavy machine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle model of 1918. Neither of these guns, however, solved the immediate problem of arming US troops. So again, French and British firearms. Unfortunately, that French Lebel rifle wasn't a doughboy's favorite. The long, heavy, single-feed, tubular magazine shoulder rifle just wasn't as nice as the Springfield 1903 or later US 1917 guns. Heck, it wasn't as nice as the US trading rifle, the Krag-Jorgensen. Despite all the shortages, these American rifles were being produced rapidly and found their way fairly quickly to the front lines, which was great for the average infantryman, but a nightmare for logistics, which now had to track 2 full-size cartridges wherever the machine rifles were deployed. Having both the Springfield and the Chauchat in the same line was a huge pain in the keister. With the BAR still over the horizon, the obvious solution was to follow the lead of the Belgians and adopt a Chauchat chambered in the US's own native 30-06 cartridge. Sleek and modern, the cartridge was named for its .3-inch bullet and 1906 adoption, making it the second and more powerful cartridge adopted for the Springfield rifle. As we know, the biggest problem with the Chauchat's development was the oddly shaped 8mm Lebel cartridge, so swapping to 30-06 should be pretty straightforward, and maybe the French and US engineers thought the same, which of course means that they were probably overconfident. Now, I'm unsure if they tried a simple Belgian-style conversion. I suspect they did, though, and I also believe they probably ran into the same problems that we saw in the Lewis gun. Recall in our previous episode on that light machine gun, we noted that it was originally chambered for the rimmed 303 cartridge and then converted easily to 7.65 Mauser for the Belgians, but 30-06 proved to be very harsh on the operating parts and required modification of the gas system in the long run. The same probably was true of the long recoil CSRG because the adoption took some months and represented a complete overhaul. While as many parts as possible were shared, the US Chauchat is much further from the original than the Belgian, which was just a straightforward conversion. A prototype was tested at Springfield in August of 1917, and one Captain Julian Hatcher was on hand. In his opinion, the gun was functional, but frankly inferior to the then prototype Browning automatic. However, that gun would not be ready for at least 8 months in his estimation, so a stopgap was approved. Curiously, the order was placed with Gladiator that same month in 1917. The model name, however, came from the beginning of production in January of 1918, which brings us to this gun today, and we can finally get a little bit closer look at its features. Alright gang, this is the sidewall of a US Chauchat. This is another CSRG made gun. To my knowledge, Sidarm did not make any of the 30-06 ones. And you may notice something right off the bat. These guns are nearly identical externally, to the point that our selector lever is still marked S, and then at the end we have C for coupe par coupe, and then if I actually rotate this over where you can see it, right at the top, we still got the M. So they didn't even bother translating this for the US troops. If we're looking at the sidewall on here, this one does have the spring in place, and this is a captive bolt. That's really about it from our differences from the French, other than what pertains specifically to the magazine and sights. Oh yeah, here's a big difference. This whole giant extension, which by the way was not done on the Belgian modification, it was a straight line, just like right there. So this guy was fitted, and then we have this new corrugated magazine. These are incredibly flimsy, I assure you. They look more rigid than the French. They certainly have fewer openings, although I have seen at least one variant that has 2 of these big old openings. And I will say, this one's kind of a pain to load because it only has the one opening, even with the preferred 30-06 cartridge in its better dimensions. I personally really dislike these magazines overall, but I think it really shows what a lot of people don't realize, which is that it's actually very difficult to make a reliable stamped steel large magazine that's going to work in the field. This is a sort of technology that took time to develop, and we won't see it start to really connect until more towards World War II. Now on this one, you can more clearly see that it also has the little loading hole. So there's a hole there. There's a hole up here, I'm backwards with my monitor, hole up here for our bullet tip so that we can compress this all the way down and then use the bullet tip to hold it in place. This magazine hates doing that, and so I'm not going to do it for you guys. I don't want to tear this up unnecessarily. So this guy will feed into the gun. Unfortunately, the gun is not tall enough to do it at a rest position, so I have to raise the gun up to get that angle, and then I can... Oh, it stinks to do it from the front. As a matter of fact, our good friend Ian, who owns this particular device, has recommended coming from the rear and then tipping forward, which works much better, but again, you have to have an even larger angle of departure, which means that prone loading for this gun is going to be sort of difficult. I do not want to be the loader for this system. It is much more difficult than the Chauchat. On release, yeah, nothing. It's not doing. You got to yank that thing out manually. You know what? Let's just leave that right there. Now, one of the good advantages of this system is that in the same area, let's put this French Chauchat mag in here. The French Chauchat mag would have been roughly there, and you can see what it's done is prevented the handle from going here. So on a French Chauchat, your handle, your forward grip handle is here, right in front of your rear grip handle, which makes it very uncomfortable. On the US Chauchat though, we now have the room, because of this straighter mag, to be able to really get up on that gun, and this feels much more comfortable. Now, another difference on the US Chauchat is the sight. It's not a lot different. The base, the adjustment, it's all the same. The notch is where the difference is. That's a square cut deep and then a deep V. It's a very US, almost buckhorn style sight. It reads a lot cleaner than the original French, although that doesn't help you any when the gun starts actually recoiling. Something else that's interesting about this is that at the time with the French Chauchat, they were having some problems with accuracy from the factory. It looks like there wasn't really a perfect zero coming from the factory. They're firing like 28 rounds per gun to get them tested, and then they were pushing them out. So there's a lot of Kentucky windage being taken by the French soldiers. Well, the US solved that by attaching a quote-unquote windage adjustable plate. You would think that you would use this screw set up in this rear plate in order to sort of by and by adjust the gun as needed in the field, but this is more of a one and done. This particular plate right here was cut for this particular gun so that it would fix any left to right zero issuings on this gun. They didn't worry about so much the vertical, that can be adjusted by just either deepening or making more shallow the groove, but also the vertical doesn't affect you very much at 200 meters because men are very narrow vertical things. So if you're off a few inches up and down, it's not a big deal. Now, despite the external changes, the internals are not very far off from our gun from last time. There's just, different tensions of this and that. So I'm not going to do another animation. You can rely on last episode for that. And we'll just take this straight over to Mae for use on the range.
Goodbye, New York town, goodbye, Miss Liberty. Your light of freedom will guide us across the sea. Every soldier's sweetheart bidding goodbye. Every soldier's
As you guys can tell from that demonstration, this is definitely a gun and bullets come out the other end. While the footage is fresh, I want to put something into perspective. During our Project Lightning special, we ranked a number of these light machine guns and machine rifles, and spoiler alert, the Lewis gun was the unanimous favorite, and the Chauchat 1918 was unanimously the worst. I say this because at the same time this gun was being ordered into production, Pershing refused delivery of 20,000 Lewis guns that were ready to go because he didn't want to add a third automatic into the mix and preferred to stay with the Chauchats until the arrival of the BAR. Those Lewis guns were already in Europe, and he said, nah, give them to aviation. Okay, so we are ordering Chauchats here. How many? 25,000 were contracted in August of 1917. By June 1918, some 18,000 had been delivered. And it appears that's about all that were made. The price, $92.25 per gun with accessories. I'd buy it. All right, that covers this gun's development. It really wasn't that in-depth. And we've already covered the development of the previous Model 1915. As you may recall from that episode, didn't really get into service life. Well, that time has come, and so I'm going to have to actually put put this gun aside for a moment without throwing her on the ground. And then I'm gonna have to put this one back up, the 1915. Surprise, surprise. Haha. And we'll go back to our Frenchman for a moment. Let me introduce you to the first French Chauchat team. Following the trials, the army settled on a two-man team, a gunner and a loader. Our gunner had a special backpack with 16 loaded magazines and 2 special front pouches, each with 2 additional magazines, for a total of 20 magazines and up to 400 rounds. He was armed with the CSRG, of course, and a ruby pistol. He'd also have a machete and some other details, but I'm gonna skip that stuff, just assume these guys have little bits and bobs in addition to what I'm telling you. Our loader has a special backpack with 16 magazines as well, and a musette bag with an additional magazine capacity of, we're not sure, I suspect 4 as well, making for another 400 rounds. The loader also carries his own 07-15 Berthier rifle. That is a lot of weight, and we'll see the loadout change pretty rapidly, but first we have to teach everyone how to shoot these guns. But that took a bit of a shakeout, and by December 1915 the first training programs were really getting established, with the actual running of them starting in January of 1916. They proved totally unrealistic, with 6 days of instruction and only 140 rounds per student. By the time the first field manuals were printed, the equipment layout was already being adjusted. This time the gunner had 12 magazines in his backpack and 4 in the same front pouches, so 320 total rounds. His CSRG, of course, and that ruby pistol. The loader hauled 11 packets of cartridges in a special backpack. These were 64 rounds each. His musette carried 4 more packets for a total of 960 rounds, and again, he had a Berthier rifle. Don't forget, all that gear was again in addition to basic infantry equipment, toolkit for the gun, cover for the gun, things like that. I suspect there were other delays in magazine deliveries by this point, given this new reliance on packets of ammunition. This would mean a lot of hand loading in the field, which, as we have seen, can be difficult with the Chauchat magazine. Now, a few hundred Chauchats served at Verdun, but these were most likely being felt out for best practices. Large numbers found their way into the Battle of the Somme, with the 6th French Army being the first to receive its full complement for the July offensive. The Somme would see the first sojourns into walking fire with the CSRG, and for the most part, it was weirdly successful. I know that's a strange thing to say because in hindsight we know that walking fire is insane, but you have to imagine that before this it was just an artillery bombardment followed by mass infantry attack with bolt actions. Having a suppressive automatic rifle, one that could focus on enemy machine gun nests, well, that is something of a pretty significant improvement, even if it's nowhere near what it needs to be yet. Still, in July 1916, Joffre would be pleased enough with the results to order that additional 55,000 that we saw last episode. There were, however, some obvious problems. Climbing over the top was a damned mess for the CSRG two-man team loaded down with all that gear and ammunition. They were just too slow and cumbersome to cross no man's land at a brisk pace. Each man had at least 88 pounds of crud to haul around. General Francois, then commanding the 10th Army, requested that the teams be given a third man so that they could keep up with the infantry and not arrive at the next trench too exhausted to hold it. The army conceded and did add a third man, lightening the overall load. The gunner now carried 4 magazines in a musette and 4 in the front pouches, so only 160 rounds. He again had the CSRG and a ruby pistol. The loader had a special backpack with 8 loaded magazines plus 1 packet of 64. The musette had 4 more packets of the same, 480 rounds in total. He surrendered his rifle for just a ruby pistol, and he had like shovels and stuff. We've covered that before. The carrier hauls 5 packets in a standard backpack, plus 64 more rounds in standard field pouches, so 384 in total. He was also equipped with a rifle, ideally, again, the Berthier. In this configuration, the carrier seems to be a hybrid of ammo carrier and rifleman, with the first guy dedicated to just keeping that CSRG gunner loaded. Around the same time, the training time had been expanded to 15 days, much more sensible, with 218 rounds provided to each man for marksmanry that was focused on semi-auto rifle fire. This is also the time in which the troops became familiar with la jifa, or the smack. You see, the horde ergonomics of the Chauchat creates a trap. By the time you get a clean sight alignment, your cheek settles naturally into that narrower rear tube. And that means that that shelf is waiting to bruise you right below the orbital socket. Genius. This means Chauchat gunners had to learn to set up at a wider angle to the gun, uncomfortable and unnatural, but much better than beating your face in. US troops tended to avoid this issue by using whatever cloth was handy as padding and just getting behind the sight anyway and taking the hit. The French were really starting to take this gun seriously. Despite the continued emphasis on walking fire, it was proving to be good at two important tasks. One, hunting German machine gun nests, and providing defense of recently taken trenches from counterattacks. This will sound familiar to viewers of our Lewis gun episode and will exemplify the key uses of light machine guns in World War II. And speaking of, Germany was getting pretty sore at the Entente's automatics, and so released a light machine gun all of their own. Okay, technically a light machine gun. This would be the MG0815, and despite it being the heaviest and most awkward of its class, it's belt-fed, water-cooled, and it is carried by a team of 5. That made it extremely dangerous to face on the battlefield. Alright, I challenge you to think of it this way. You're already terrified of the Maxim MG08 on the other side. It's killed hundreds of thousands of your friends. And now, you found a way to kind of deal with it. You've got these light machine gun teams, maybe a couple guys with grenades. You're starting to get the prototypes for how to deal with this. And just as you think you're seeing a balance, suddenly there's twice as many of those guns. Half of them are highly mobile, and they're maybe 20% less effective at sustained fire, maybe. And they're pointed at you. That sinking feeling you're experiencing now was both the inspiration for the Germans' universal machine gun program post-war and the French wartime response of bulking up the Chauchat teams as an emergency measure, which they would expand to 4 men and then later up to 6 men. Now, instead of detailing every evolution, let's skip just a bit ahead. In the grander context, 1917 was, for the French, a calmer year for the war, relatively. Joffre was out, and his affinity for constant attack had exhausted the troops, which led to a fairly widespread mutiny. I say mutiny, but for the most part, the troops were willing to defend. They just were not going to go on any more pointless attacks, and I would not disagree with them there. Also, I'm greatly simplifying this. It wasn't just Joffre who had helped beat the morale into complete submission, but we're a gun-focused show, so we're moving on. You guys can turn to a much more extensive reading as to why the French army nearly collapsed. Under Pétain, that army did start listening to its troops. Troop rotations, home leave, and relaxing the severity of punishments helped improve things immensely. Much of 1917 was spent settling the soldiers, thus preventing an outright revolt like we saw in Russia. Pétain also knew the Americans, heavy artillery production, and those little Renault tanks were all on their way. So why rush into needless, unsupported attacks when you could just defend until production and technology outpaced the Germans? And while we had the breathing room, why not do some research on these Chauchat? Well, under Pétain, the CSRG was expanded in its role again. There was now a squad leader. He carried a Massut bag and 4 loaded magazines and a 56 cartridge packet, totaling just 136 rounds. He also had a Lebel rifle along with some special equipment. Again, we're not getting into those details. The gunner had 4 magazines in some improved front pouches, these being modified to avoid damaging the flimsy mags when he dove for the ground, and a Massut bag with 4 more magazines for a total of 160 rounds, and a Ruby pistol. The loader now had an improved special pack with 8 magazines, 1 64-round packet, a special Massut bag with 8 magazines, for a total of 384 rounds, and a ruby pistol. The carrier now has a backpack with 12 magazines and one 64-round packet for 304 total. He is also armed with a Lebel or Berthier rifle, but this would soon give way to the Berthier Mousqueton. Each team would have up to 3 of these carriers. That may seem like a lot, but we're not done. This Chauchat team was paired with up to 8 soldiers with both long rifles and grenades, and up to 4 VBs. The Vivien Vessiers rifle grenade. These were used as extremely light but immediately adaptable artillery and allowed forward French units to target communications, trench junctions that would inhibit enemy movement and resupply, or even just the latrines in order to demoralize the enemy. On the assault, they were indispensable, especially against German machine gun positions, which they could now saturate with explosives when located. These squads were usually run in pairs and used on the assault to aggressively seek and silence enemy machine gun positions. They were extremely effective and welcomed by the French infantry. Alright, so what about the US Chauchat teams? Well, they were a bit more stable, having gained experience for the French. There was generally a corporal who carried a musette with 6 magazines, so he'd have 120 rounds if we're talking about 8mm. He had a rifle, either Springfield 1903 or Enfield 1917, a 1911 pistol, and, like the French counterpart, carried a wire cutter and some other goodies. The gunner had a musette bag with 5 magazines, so 100 rounds, his Chauchat, and a 1911 pistol. The carriers each had a musette with 6 magazines and one 64-round packet, so 184 a pop, and they each had a rifle. You generally had a minimum of 2 carriers, and of course everyone had their standard US haversack rations and various tools. I should also explain something that doesn't really fit our graphic, that corporal usually oversaw 2 Chauchat teams, so you'd have one of him, 2 gunners, 4 carriers. US machine rifle training was modeled on the French schools and spun up by French instructors. The US operator's manual, however, those were much more extensive. We provided our guys with detailed drawings, tactical suggestions, and apparently no mention of that 30-06 gun. Haven't found a manual yet for that particular guy. That is weird considering the number that we actually adopted. Okay, so that's all neat and tidy, but how did the Chauchat perform? Well, one of the earliest assessments that we know of was a British test in December of 1915. They ran both the CS machine rifle and an early CSRG. Chauchat himself was in attendance. I'm unsure how the CS machine rifle did, but they found the CSRG interesting, but unsuitable for combat. And the problem? Well, it starts right off with, you guessed it, weak magazines. The guns also had terrible ergonomics, poor accuracy, mostly from difficulty controlling the gun under recoil, excessive muzzle flash, again this is before they added the flash hider, and the long recoil system was a bit of a weak spot overall. You know, other than that last one, we have already seen the French admit to the rest, so I'd give the British assessment a lot of weight. In their testing, using the gun at a high angle above 75 degrees could result in failure to return to battery. That's because of the heavy weight placed on the return spring, which must move the whole barrel assembly forward after each shot, all the way forward, before releasing the bolt to do the same. Lots of ground to cover, lots of weight to push, and a lot of surface area to drag when you're dealing with long recoil. The French soldiers, who burned much more ammunition, would also identify another indirect problem with long recoil. With 300 or 400 rounds of sustained fire, the aluminum heat shield that's around the barrel but inside the barrel jacket, that would expand and eventually bind. With all that extra length having to move such a great distance, this happened more frequently and required about 5 minutes to cool off before you could start shooting again. But let me tell you, you start firing rapidly, it's going to come right back. This doomed the CSRG into never being a true light machine gun replacement. Burst was about the best that you could really do with this gun in a fight, which was practically already the case thanks to its horrible shaking, just trying to control the thing. In a second British test in 1916, they also noticed something unusual. When firing 100 rounds for accuracy, the full auto setting was on average only 3 seconds faster than the semi-auto, thanks to that difficulty in controlling the gun during recoil. They also noticed that as the guns were run hard, more and more parts worked loose, or were even slowly warped. The French would also discover this in the late war testing, where it was revealed that freshly assembled Chauchat were significantly more precise shooting than those that had been used repeatedly, somewhat due to wear, but also due to loosening and resetting parts. Our own gunsmith Mark commented on this in our post-Project Lightning interview, that the Chauchat loves to try and shed their screws after sustained use. So the guns don't just beat you to death, they beat themselves to death as well. French surveys in 1916 and 1917 revealed further concerns. The guns were vulnerable to mud thanks to all the openings and loose construction, and mud was plentiful on the front. Overall, for the French, the Chauchat had three major problems. The magazines were flimsy and difficult to load. Part of that was the fault of the 8mm cartridge, part of that was construction. Long recoil plus heat or mud is not so great. The guns needed constant service. Crews must be well trained to care for the guns, or else they failed pretty quickly. I've had cars like that. Now, all these same problems plagued the US Chauchat in 30-06, plus one additional. Unlike the Belgian conversions, the US guns were not extracting well. The problem, however, was not noticed by the French inspectors, who only fired 24 rounds in approving the guns. Instead, the US found out, well, basically through issuing them in the field, where they were under sustained fire. The guns then started to either fail to extract or to just go ahead and tear case heads off on rare occasion. The problem seemed to have gone back and forth for some time, and ultimately was resolved too late to save these guns from a terrible reputation. And yeah, I sat here and badmouthed the Chauchat, but the pure hatred the Americans seem to have had for the gun likely comes from this guy, well, not this guy, the other guy, the 30-06 in particular. And yeah, the US magazines are somehow more flimsy than the French, but the real fault is with the barrel maker. The 30-06 barrels were not produced correctly, and the necks were too narrow. And that final chamber polish was poorly done, making it slightly coarse. And when you heated that up, it led to binding, and combined with long recoil operation, where the gas pressure inside the chamber is all spent before extraction starts, and it's not terribly reliable. Honestly, it seems like the US tried to forget about the 30-06 model 1918. I found no manuals, almost no opinions. Archival Research Group has found maybe 2 memos that reference the gun briefly, and I've turned up this one photo from January of 1919. And until that photo, this was the only one that was known of the gun in service, obviously a staged display from an unknown location, maybe on the trench line. This is incredible when you recall that over 20,000 of the guns were produced, and yet we know so little about them, observed them so infrequently in period sources. My belief is that the guns unreliable on the front were replaced as quickly as possible or relegated to rear line or training duty. Andrew from Archival Research shared a memo with me that notes the 363rd Infantry would turn in all of their Model 1918s, and another note attempts to recall a certain number to be replaced with either 1915s or BARs as quickly as possible. We know that when the US packed up to go home from the war, they gave the 8mm over to the French, but the 30-06s, no one seems to know. I suspect that they were not worth the cost of shipping home and no one else wanted them, so they were probably scrapped, which makes them exceedingly rare today. So I want to thank a certain mustachioed gentleman for loaning us this one today. All right, I've painted a pretty bleak picture so far, but what did the troops think of these guns? Well, most accounts are pretty transactional, a lot like this one. Alfred Hall, armed with an automatic rifle, stood on the railway track. As the Bolshes ran out of the railway station, Hall would line them up as on running rabbits. His automatic rifle would remark briefly, "Pup, pup, pup," and Mr. Bolsh would go down. Honestly, the best praise for these guns came from a number of accounts of assaults where the Chauchat allowed for sudden, decisive action against the enemy. The gunner being able to leap from cover and pepper a known position, that was its greatest feat. And I'd agree, its slow rate of fire and narrow light frame make it the best gun I know of in the Great War for actual hip fire. That is, of course, when it runs. A helpful viewer found and sent this 1922 recollection my way, taken from a history of Company B, 311th Infantry. One Chauchat ran out of ammunition. The other was in Cocker's hands, and he used it well until it jammed. He worked at it desperately for several minutes as he advanced the line, but then threw it up against a tree in disgust, crying bitterly, "That's a hell of a thing to give a man to fight with." By the end of the war, even the French were looking to replace the gun. Seeing the army eyeing the BAR, Pétain himself would halt its adoption, fearing mixing ammunition and starting an awful conversion program before the spring offensive. That's the big plan, by the way, for no real advantage in his eyes. When the war ended, so did production of the Chauchat, though, as the French knew it would not remain in service through peacetime. In the end, they'd quickly adopt the Châteauroux Model 1924, and then several others over the years, making the Chauchat a distant reserve weapon at the outbreak of World War II, although it was present. All that said, I actually think the Chauchat is one of the most crucial firearms of the war, despite the problems, despite troop disappointments, despite the varied quality of the guns themselves. Roughly 275,000 of these things were cranked out in just 33 months, and they were more numerous than any other model in the war. And weirdly, they fit the initial lemming-like attacks of the French army. They fit the bill of what they asked for. Look at the US usage. We fielded them because they could not get anything else into the line, which is better. 50 out of 100 of your guns working correctly, or no guns working correctly. And that's even an exaggeration in itself, because the worst data I found on the 1918 said perhaps a 40% failure rate, which was very extreme. 40% failure rate's crazy for a service firearm. But again, 60% of the guns running versus no machine guns. It's a hard call in a horrible gun, or in a horrible war, and you kind of have to compare it to like German Volkssturm weapons. They had effectively nothing for light automatics, and then suddenly they had plenty. That's pretty powerful no matter how poor the gun. And despite all the complaints of quality, both of the guns you saw may fire were considered dang near disposable 100 years ago, and both of them are running today, with no more maintenance put into them than would have been necessary at the time. All right, I'm getting a little preachy, so we must be near the end of the story. So let's go ahead and wrap this one up. Louis Chauchat, having introduced the CRSRG and seeing to its production, turned his attention back to autoloading rifles. Working with both Sutter and Ribeyrolles, they were successful in a way and managed the RSC 1917, a rifle I hope to cover in the not too distant future. Unfortunately though, this would be Chauchat's last act, as he would pass away due to his long-suffering illness in 1917, never having seen the end of the war. I suppose he was also spared the worst maligning of his name, as history remembered his gun among the worst, but most of those people echoing the sentiment have never handled a Chauchat, and I know someone who has, Mae. So let's get her in here and find out how she feels about both of these metal monsters. All right, gang, once more, we have Mae, and we have two Chauchats now. That's double the Chauchat. So this time, we're talking about mostly the 30-06. Last time we talked about the 8 mil, but we left you on a cliffhanger in terms of whether or not Mae would like to actually fight with either of these guns, because I thought it was worth discussing after you heard all the horror show of what was the service history. So let's see where we're going with this. Now, first and foremost though, we need to talk ergonomics. These guns are nearly identical, but maybe Mae could walk us through the brief differences between the two.
So there are a few minor differences. One of the biggest ones was definitely the magazine on this one for the 30-06. It is definitely worse. Honestly, just loading them in every round, it was incredibly difficult. Like I just found the spring, maybe it's the spring tension in here, I don't know, but I just found it was pinching my fingers every time.
I got so excited because the 8 mil magazine is the worst magazine I've ever loaded in my life.
And you're thinking, no, it can't get worse.
Yeah, I was like, this will be so much simpler. It's not. It's still bad. I mean, it's not as bad as trying to turn the corner with the 8 mils, but it's almost as bad loading this magazine.
It was quite bad. And then unfortunately, it's not as easy to get in and out. I had the hardest time with this mag. I really, truly did. So not a fan of the 30-06 Chauchat magazines.
Now the good news is, after all the complaints about the flimsiness of this mag, they did close this one up a little bit more. And
True.
they have this corrugation to make it stiffer. And yet every single one I've encountered is bent to crap and feeds terribly. Mark had to do a ton of work on this and the other ones.
Oh yeah, Mark did have to repair all of them. So luckily they all ran with up to 16 rounds in them, but the problem is that, it took him repairing them in order for them to be functional.
I think it would take like 3 pounds of pressure to fold that thing in half. Okay, so what else? So the magazines are different, harder to get in and out of, just as weak and hard to load. What else do we got that's different on this particular gun?
So yeah, I would honestly say the handle was a definite improvement on this one, where the handle placement is. So like the 8mm Chauchat, I complained about it before, how the handle's right there next to the trigger and you're having to hold all of the mass of the gun in one place. Well, at least the 30-06 Chauchat, I can now spread out, so I can hold the whole mass of the gun over the distance, so it totally makes a huge difference. I thought walking fire and carrying this one around, much easier, way better. And then the really only other difference, and it technically wasn't even a difference, was the sight. So the sights on this one, they are over to the left more, so that I should have had a better sight picture, but interestingly enough, our 8mm Chauchat, it had the improved sight on it that's already adjusted to the left, is that improvement sight attachment. So realistically, this one should have had the better sight, but because of the improvement on this 8mm Chauchat sight was already there, technically they pretty much equaled out.
Yeah, it's interesting. The cutaway for this sight is deeper. It's almost like a buckhorn in a way. And it's a very US style sight. And you'd think that that deep trough would make it better. And somehow I just got even more lost. True.
Oh, before I even forget, the very last thing though, recoil. Can we talk about that for a minute? Terrible on the 30-06 Chauchat. Oh my goodness, that one was beating all of us up. That was awful.
If you ever get the opportunity to shoot Chauchats, by all means, make sure you shoot the 8mm first, because you'll lay down behind it and wonder how you just took the worst beating of your life from any gun you've ever fired. And then you get to do it all over again because the 30-06 is worse.
Oh God, it's just, the flashbacks on that are quite awful.
Shake, rattle, and roll. So, anything else really that stands out between the two?
There's really not much else difference. Were the bipods that much different in terms of height, I want to say?
There's a slight variation in height, but ultimately I feel like the 30-06 somehow was even worse, and I felt like I was having even more trouble getting up over it in addition to that heavy recoil.
Yep.
And it's hard to tell. By the way, we're both struggling to remember which one was worse in terms of height, because they just are so...
They're both so atrociously high that they don't make any sense.
Once you're uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. It's the, you know, being a little bit more uncomfortable doesn't change much. So I'm going to tell you though, if you took that front sight and the rear sight and moved them an inch to the left, just got them off the side of that gun.
Oh, that'd be way better.
And cut 2 inches off these bipods.
Yep.
How much would your opinion change on these guns?
It would be, they definitely improved by a whole nother level at the very least, just because that's the biggest issue, I would say, when it came to accuracy with these. Like, granted, you're still having to deal with that long, heavy, like, recoil, but, it'd make it way easier to handle.
Yeah, if we were a different show, I'd be making a new front sight system so that we could just get it over and, throwing the pin on this and putting on a rear sight. That's a lot of work. I know you guys would get excited by it. It's a lot of work to prove a point. I'm very sure of the point. Like, I think it will work very well. So that's really it in terms of comparing the two, right? There's nothing that stands out. So better at hip fire because the grips are further apart, worse at reloading because the magazine's a pain and has a lower capacity, and then worse because of recoil.
I think I remember the selector on the 30-06 was slightly stiffer, but the problem is that I don't know if that was just
Sample
them in
of
general or, sample of one.
So it could be any number of things. But... overall very comparable to each other except for that dang recoil. And weirdly, I did not mind the recoil at all on the hip, and I hated it from the shoulder.
Yeah, that was interesting. You don't tend to notice these on the hip, I guess just because, especially with the 30-06, because of where my hands are, the recoil standing with this one was better, just because of that alone.
So hip-firing guns from World War I, who's the king?
The 30-06 was definitely the king on that one. It's interesting. And I don't want to get into, some of the others that we use for Project Lightning or anything like that, but definitely between the two of them, the 30-06 was king with that one, hands down, just because of the handle.
Yeah, I would get into the other ones. We have sample footage, and other people have seen Project Lightning. I would say I think the 30-06 Chauchat was the best hip handling gun out of the entire series, and that kind of puts something into perspective because they were designed to be fired from the hip. That was one of the considerations in converting from the 1913 to the 1915 is we want to fire this from the hip. That is its primary duty. They had not really gotten around to the entire combined arms theory of partnering with the grenades or specifically using it as a light machine gun. They were using it as a walking fire device, which is a lot like the BAR. The BAR was built to be a walking fire device. And I think between the two, and we've done episodes on both, the low rate of fire on this makes it
better. That one is actually better, in my opinion, when it comes to walking fire, I would say, which is really probably going to get some poor comments there.
Yeah, well, the BAR had much better. Which would you rather use prone?
Well, BAR prone, weirdly enough. Even though, can I have the bipod?
Well, that's a much later gun. But this with its bipod or the BAR with no bipod, it's like terrible bipod or no bipod. No bipod. You know what I mean? And again, which one would you use in full auto prone? Neither.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I feel like I'm just playing the worst of the worst game when it comes to those two. And it's unfortunate because they're both really neat guns. But the problem is that they both have their own faults when it comes to these things.
No, they're both guns that I would rather run in semi-auto than in full auto.
Yeah.
So that's kind of bringing us around, though. So we're starting to make some comparisons. It's time to maybe talk about, would you take one of these guys into battle? Let me hand you that.
This? Okay.
Yep. Okay, you can have that gun.
This is mine now.
Yep. Now, first off, 30-06, are we taking that into battle?
You know, it's interesting. So I've got a machine gun. Oh, wait. Okay, here, I got this. So can we change the ruling on this? Can I have a team with me?
Well, team or no team, I'm not touching that thing.
Really? So you wouldn't touch it with a team?
40% failure rate.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Because this one runs and this is one of the ones that didn't fail. It made it 100 years in the future. So you have a 40% failure rate that no amount of people on your team can help you with. So we're talking about just the 30-06. How's that one doing?
Honestly, it slipped my mind the 40% failure rate on that. So if I'm aware of those statistics, yeah, I'm probably actually going to turn it down, which is unfortunate because the cartridge isn't bad. And like I said, it's a great transport fire. Like, it's great for walking fire. The selector is actually pretty straightforward. It's just the problem with the sights, the recoil, the mags, and the fact that it's got that failure rate. Oh goodness, what am I walking into with that one?
Not only that, but the best feature of these guns being in the battlefield is not actually walking fire. We should almost completely discredit walking fire because in the real usage, they would get up, lay down, suppress, grenade, suppress.
Now, if I'm setting it up on a trench or something like that and I'm standing with it, that doesn't seem like too bad.
No, but it's still terrible recoil.
You still have to look down those sights.
Yes. Ooh. Still the sights, still the terrible recoil, still getting beat up, and 40% failure rate.
This is bad.
Yeah.
It's not looking good.
So what, yes or no?
I'm going to probably go with a no on this one just because of that failure rate adding in there. That brings it to a no.
Okay. And then we have problems with the French supply, but what's in your hand now isn't even what you shot. This is a different Chauchat. This one's in for service from Mark. Currently, it can't run and select fire yet. So before this gets repaired, you'll have to kind of use your imagination, but this is a sidearm. This is the better Chauchat, and you can kind of tell. The finish is nice and clean. The parts feel tighter. This doesn't feel like the loose, rattly Chauchat that we shot. So let's buff everything in the favor. Let's say you have one of the only 20-some-odd thousand sidearm ones, the good ones, the 8mm Chauchats. Is that enough for you to take this into battle? Remember, 300, 400 round burst, and she's locked up the barrel for 10 minutes. You've got the terrible mud in the action. You've got a team of up to 4, 5, 6 guys that will help you with it. Do you take something like this into conflict? This is a game of economy versus quality.
So I'm having to worry about the mud getting into the action and into that open mag. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. Having to worry about after 300 rounds it locking. Well, 300, 400. Maybe I'm lucky, 400. But I do have a team there to not only assist me with loads, but also assisting me with cover fire. Right. So essentially, I've got a team there with me to help just some suppressive fire, essentially. Right. That's not too bad. I think I would take this into battle with that consideration.
And again, that 300, 400 is for sustained automatic fire, not semi-automatic fire. You can semi-automatic fire this thing for quite a while. And so the question is, do you want a big, weird auto-loading rifle in a team of 6 people, let's say? Or do you just want 6 people with regular bolt rifles and no weird, big auto-loading rifle mixed in?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I feel like in this situation, with the team included in that, it's better to have an automatic rifle on your side because this one didn't have the failure rate that we're seeing with the 30-06. This one actually did do all right, just up until eventually it would lock up after sustained fire of hundreds of rounds going down range. So, I mean, unless I'm just going, like crazy on this one, I think I would still take the Chauchat with that.
For me, it would depend on my role. So if I'm just an infantryman and I just have the usual goals of getting there and surviving, it probably would be better than a rifle, and I'd like the help and everything like that. I would also be a higher priority target for the enemy, so maybe I'd rather just stay cool with my gun.
You'd also be a bigger target.
Well, okay, but that's a different animal. The big thing for me, though, is if you're hunting enemy machine gun nests and you're offered this, or remember, the option against this is nothing, unless you're the U.S. who gave up Lewis guns for some, again, no to this thing. Why would they pick this over Lewis guns? But if you're French and it's this or nothing, like this or a bolt action, I'm going with it. Like, this is one of those weird situations where if I could choose any other light machine gun, I would. But the choice was that or nothing. And I think that this is a reasonable choice in that context.
I think it's absolutely better than nothing. But yeah, honestly, so into the final tally is no to the 30-06, yes to the 8mm.
By the barest possible margin. Okay, so that's going to have us all wrapped up. Is there anything else you want to comment on these guns?
No, you know what? It is unfortunate that they're getting the rep they're getting. They're both beautiful guns, and honestly, at the end of the day, I still enjoyed shooting them, and I had a lot of fun. But the problem is that if you put yourself into wartime situations, it becomes scary as heck to carry these things.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And to be fair, in terms of like being not the best gun, it doesn't matter. It's the gun that was there, and it's the gun that exudes World War I. And it's just an honor to be able to hold and borrow these things. They're fantastic. So thank you all for loaning them.
Yes.
And if you guys want to know any more about what's going on with the show itself, stay after the credits for any updates. But other than that, we're going to say goodbye.
Have a good one.
Alright gang, there is nothing super significant to give you today for an update. Instead, as usual, check out the shop over at C&Rsenal.com. Support us on Patreon, where you can actually see what will be our next big update, the announcement of 5 new shirt designs and a new shirt campaign. That's pretty exciting. But otherwise, we are just trucking away, trying to get it back onto schedule and ahead in production so this show can run nice and smoothly for you from here on out.
Sweet. I love it.